We've always known dictators to play fast and loose with the truth, especially when it comes to the state of their economies. But there is now a novel way of uncovering their lies. Using satellites, not only can we reveal the scale of their deception, but we can also find the worst offenders. This is a groundbreaking new approach developed by Professor Luis Martinez, which was featured in the Wall Street Journal and in The Economist, and we will explain and visualize it in this video. First, how do we measure an economy? The most common one is the gross domestic product, or GDP, which is used to compare the economy performance of different countries. Now, why would you lie about the economy? Well, to put it simply, economic performance reflects power, and because of this, leaders have an incentive to manipulate their numbers to make their economies look more impressive than they actually are. This is especially tempting in authoritarian countries without checks and balances. And why would dictators manipulate their economic growth? Because of two things: opportunity and motive. There is opportunity because power is usually absolute in dictatorships, and questioning leadership can be dangerous for those doing the questioning. And then there is motive because dictators want to avoid an image of incompetence and weakness. Projecting power is essential to staying a dictator. So, how do you figure out who is lying about their numbers? This is where things get interesting, and we need to get creative. GDP is typically published by a country's national statistical agency, which compiles information from many sources. In a democracy, these figures might be trustworthy, but in a dictatorship, this data is typically provided by the dictator, and it can easily be manipulated. But there is one measure that dictators are not able to manipulate. It turns out that how bright a country's lights shine at night is a good proxy for its GDP, meaning that if a country shines brighter this year compared to last, it's an indication that the economy has grown. Let's take a look at 25 countries around the world. First, we need to differentiate these countries by their levels of freedom. There are those that are free, partially free, and not free. We base this differentiation on work done by Freedom House, an organization that measures the degree of freedom of every country every year and assigns them a score from 0 to 100. Now that we've categorized each country, we can compare their reported growth over the last 20 years with their expected growth based on satellite images of how much brighter these countries shine at night today compared to 20 years ago. Let's start with the democratic or free countries. Based on satellite images, we would expect the following growth numbers over the last 20 years. Now, let's compare this to the numbers these countries actually reported. Greece. Satellite data predicted that the Greek economy shrank by 10% over the last 20 years. The country went through significant economic challenges, requiring bailout loans and many years of austerity. Official numbers are mostly in line, reporting a decline of 8%. It got darker in the birthplace of democracy, and satellites picked up on it. Japan's economy went through a lost decade in the early 2000s. With slow growth and deflation now compounded by declining birth rates, an aging population, and labor shortages. Even so, over the last 20 years their economy managed to grow by a small 10%, based on official data and supported by satellite data. Germany. One of the economic powerhouses of Europe, Germany has an export-driven model, supported by their reputation for high-quality engineering. Currently the third largest economy in the world, it's just no longer growing as fast as the others. Nonetheless, over the past 20 years, its economy grew by just above 20%, supported by both official and satellite data. The United Kingdom. The UK's economy is dominated by the financial services industry, with London being the second largest financial center in the world. But it's now faced with Brexit uncertainty after the country voted to leave the European Union, its biggest trading partner. Over the last 20 years, the UK's economy has officially grown by 30%. Again, a figure that the satellite data of lights at night show to be accurate. The United States. The world's largest economy by nominal GDP accounts for a quarter of global economic activity and provides the world's reserve currency in the form of the US dollar. In terms of economic growth, official numbers are backed by satellites, both showing growth just above 40% over the past 20 years. Australia. The country down under holds the record for the longest uninterrupted stretch of GDP growth in the developed world, not having experienced a recession between 1991 and 2020, when the world was hit by the COVID pandemic. Official numbers as well as satellite data confirm that over the last 20 years, their economy grew by more than 60%. South Korea. Notable for its rapid economic growth from an underdeveloped nation to a high-income country in the space of just a few generations. Over the last 20 years, South Korea's economy has grown by 80%, according to satellite images, and around 85% according to official data. Still close. Poland. Considered one of the most successful post-communist states, their economy is now the sixth largest in the European Union. Over the last 20 years, the Polish economy has doubled in size, and official data is again backed by satellite images. Ireland was nicknamed the Celtic Tiger when the country experienced rapid economic growth around the turn of the millennium. Low tax rates attracted many multinational tech and pharma companies to invest their money. In the last 20 years, the Irish economy exploded by more than 150%, and satellites picked up higher light output as well. Ghana is one of the biggest success stories on the African continent, benefiting from political stability, good economic management, and wealth and natural resources. According to official data, their economy has more than tripled in the last 20 years, with satellites seeing their growth just slightly lower. Looking at our sample of 10 free countries, we're not very far off between what the official data suggests and what satellite images show. But if we switch from free to partially free countries, things start to look a bit different. Based on satellite images, we would expect the following growth numbers. And now, looking at what these countries actually reported, we begin to see some larger gaps emerging. Let's take a closer look at a few more extreme examples. Nigeria is the country with the largest GDP in Africa, with a growing manufacturing, financial, and entertainment sector, known as Nollywood. Officially, their economy has grown by more than 130% in the last 20 years. However, only 90% of this is backed by satellite data. Whilst generally considered a free country, it faces significant challenges in fully ensuring and protecting these freedoms. Peru is rich in natural resources, and their economy was boosted by the commodity boom at the beginning of this millennium, which resulted in increased investment in mining and infrastructure. However, Peru is faced with political instability, with corruption scandals and changes in government. Claiming their economy has grown by 135%, satellites only give them credit for less than 110%. The Philippines' economy is in the midst of transitioning from agriculture to services and manufacturing and experienced significant economic growth, officially by almost 150%. But in reality, satellite images estimate the growth to be closer to only 110%. Whilst the Philippines still operates with periodic elections, there are concerns about democratic backsliding and authoritarian tendencies. Bangladesh is supposedly one of the fastest-growing economies in the world, but is this really the case? Official data indicates their economy more than tripled in the last 20 years. That is a 200% increase. But looking at the increase in light output suggests a more modest 140% growth. The country has experienced periods of political unrest and controversy surrounding elections, as well as concerns about press freedom and restrictions on political opposition. India. The new most populous country in the world has surpassed China with a population of 1.4 billion people. India's economy is driven by domestic consumption, which accounts for 70% of its GDP. Over the last 20 years, India claims to have grown by more than 210%. However, nightlights paint a different picture, suggesting growth of less than 170%. India is considered the world's largest democracy, but with challenges in governance and corruption. Now, we finally get to those countries considered not free, and there we see the most extreme examples of exaggerated economies, including Libya. The country's economy is heavily dependent on oil, but its political situation has been volatile. Dictator Muammar Gaddafi ruled the country for over 4 decades until his death in 2011. Until then, he held both absolute political and military power, suppressed political opponents, limited freedom of speech, and manipulated state resources. Since his death, Libya has been plagued by instability and civil war, with 2 rival administrations fighting for power and control. Official data claims their economy has grown by almost 10% over the last 20 years, but satellite images reveal it has actually shrunk by 35%. Russia. Welcome to the world of dictator Vladimir Putin, who concentrated his power through suppressing political opponents, manipulating elections, and taking control of the media. Not only did the free world stop believing in what data Russian agencies publish, but Putin now completely refuses to disclose major economic indicators, such as trade data, oil and gas outputs, capital flows, as well as air passenger volumes. Officially, Russia has grown by more than 70% in the last 20 years. But according to the night sky, something that even Putin cannot manipulate, Russia has only grown by 40%. Kazakhstan. Russia's neighbor became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For almost 3 decades following independence, the country was led by President Nursultan Nazarbayev, who held significant power and displayed authoritarian tendencies. Organizations like the World Bank have already raised concerns about the accuracy of Kazakhstan's economic data. The country claims to have grown by 160% over the last 20 years, whereas satellite estimates put this number at a more modest 90%. Turkey's economy over the last 20 years has been volatile, to say the least. Please check the link to watch my other video where we covered Turkey's economic rise, which turned into a bubble and then ended in currency collapse and soaring inflation. This all happened under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has dominated Turkish politics for more than 2 decades. And in addition to the usual dictator toolkit of suppressing the opposition and undermining democratic norms and institutions, has displayed some unusual dictatorial tendencies, such as running a very unusual economic experiment in his country. He claims Turkey has grown by more than 170%, but nightlights suggest a more sober 120%. Rwanda. The country has been dominated by the Rwandan Patriotic Front after the genocide in 1990. President Paul Kagame has been in power since the beginning of this millennium and rules with an iron fist and is often heavily criticized for authoritarianism, suppressing political dissent, and arresting or even assassinating dissident voices. But Rwanda is also often held up as an African success story, credited with progress in healthcare, education, and economic growth, at least based on the government's own data. Officially, Rwanda has grown by almost 260%, but if we look at satellite images, this number tumbles to below 140%. This is the biggest discrepancy we've seen so far. But it doesn't end here. China. We're all familiar with their one-party system led by the Chinese Communist Party, with suppression of political opponents and extensive control over the media and internet being some of the more visible hallmarks of the China's dictatorship. Xi Jinping has consolidated his power over the years since he came to power in 2012, for example, by removing term limits on his presidency, allowing him to potentially remain in power indefinitely. China had the lowest freedom score and one of the largest exaggerations of economic growth across all countries. The Chinese Communist Party prides itself on having supposedly achieved growth of more than 380% over the past 20 years, when satellites predict China's growth to only be around 180%. The scale of China's deception is insane. In absolute terms, satellite data implies China's GDP is about $7 trillion lower, which is significantly smaller than what the Chinese Communist Party says. This gap alone is larger than the entire economies of Japan and the United Kingdom combined. But don't tell the dictators that their secret has been exposed. They might just shift from just manipulating their economic growth figures to deceive their population in the world to doing something crazy like building light farms to create the illusion of economic growth and thereby deceive the satellites as well. If you enjoyed this video, please like and leave a comment. And if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to my new channel and turn on notifications.